Now moving on to the third factor, so the availability of close substitutes. And this is one that you could intuitively work out as well. So if there are more substitutes available for a certain product, if the price of that product goes up, then a lot of people are going to go to those substitutes instead. And so that demand is going to decrease a lot more with that price increase. And so the more substitutes there are, the more elastic the demand is for that product. Versus if there are less substitutes around, then there's not as many places to go with a price increase. So the demand can go down with a price increase, but it's not going to go down as much versus if there's a lot of substitutes around. So the product then would be more inelastic or less elastic. So another way you might see this worded is if there's more competition for a product around versus if there's less competition. Now, one thing I want to mention just in general that happens with the price elasticity of demand, and it relates to this fairly well, is that over time, no matter the product, over time more substitutes become available. More competitors come into the market. So over time what happens is that price elasticity of demand increases. Right, so sometimes this concept you may not see within these certain factors, but I thought it'd be a good time to bring it up within this factor because over time, more substitutes become available, and so that price elasticity of demand increases over time. So in the present moment, there may be less substitutes, but over time, more substitutes are going to come in, so that price elasticity of demand is going to increase. Another subcategory that's related to this that you'll see certain sources mention, it's the breadth of definition of a product. And so what this means, the two cases that can happen is a product can be more narrowly defined. I'll explain what that means in a sec, and it can be more broadly defined. And this actually relates to that availability of close substitutes. So a good example of this is shoes. So shoes is a very broad category. So that would be here. But a more narrowly defined set of shoes would be like Nike running shoes. And so if you think about both of these scenarios, which of these is going to have more substitutes? Is there more substitutes for shoes, or is there more substitutes for Nike running shoes? Well, there's going to be more substitutes for the Nike running shoes. If the price of Nike running shoes increases, then people can go buy Reebok running shoes or Adidas running shoes. So the more narrowly defined a product is in general, the more substitutes, so the more elastic. Versus the more broadly defined, shoes in general, if the price of shoes just in general, all shoes, goes up, there's less substitutes for that. People aren't just going to start walking barefoot. So if the price of shoes goes up, that demand is not going to decrease as much. So the more broadly defined a product is in general, the more general that category, the less elastic, or the more inelastic that product is. Right? So this here, sometimes you'll see again this may be its own factor, but I just decided to put it here because it closely relates to that availability of close substitutes. The more narrowly defined, the more substitutes, the more elastic. The more broadly defined, the less substitutes, the less elastic. And the fourth factor is transition costs, or the cost of switching products. And so the higher the transition costs, even if there's a lot of substitutes available, if the transition costs of switching the product are high, then that product is going to be less elastic. So even like phone service providers, there's usually a contract. And if you want to switch to another phone service provider, there's going to be a premium you're going to have to pay to get out of that contract. Or if you buy a house, then you're locked into a certain mortgage for a certain time period at a certain rate, right? And if you want to get out of that, there's going to be a premium to pay. So even if there's a lot of substitutes available, if those transition costs are high, then that product is going to be less elastic or more inelastic. And then the opposite, if there are lower transition costs, then just in general, that good is going to be more elastic. It's going to have a higher elasticity of demand because switching to close substitutes is going to be easier. And so if the price of a certain good goes up, then that demand for it is going to go down a lot more if it has lower transition costs versus another good that has higher transition costs.